Okay, so here we have a 7.5 inch front differential clamshell front diff out of Toyota. This is 7.5 inch, which is in terms of basically the ring gear size that's on the inside. And they call it a clamshell because basically it's a clamshell because it's has two sections that kind of hold the differential in. So it's almost kind of comes around like a shell that kind of covers up the diff. So that's why it kind of gets the nickname clamshell front differential. Well, anyways, I am working on putting in some Yukon gears, 488 gears. We're going from 410 to 488s. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be installing an ARB locker. So the ARB locker requires drilling into the housing and a few special cups and other things and seals and brass fittings and lines to be all put in there, but those will come on later. So for right now, I just kind of want to just illustrate the disassembly of a clamshell front differential. So first things first, we have to remove the extension housing. So first we're going to remove this extension housing, then the ADD actuator housing, and then after that we'll actually open up the case and then be able to check out the ring gear, and then afterwards we will be removing the pinion flange and the pinion on the inside as well. So one thing to note is that I will be not reusing practically any of these components, so we don't need to do a whole lot of measuring before we do, because normally you would take a measurement of preload, which is your preload, which is the amount of force it takes to turn this, which is the amount of tension that's on the bearings that are right inside here, the pinion bearings. The other thing you would want to measure before you disassemble one is backlash. Now that's if you're trying to put it back to stock, pretty much if you're using all the same parts. Now, I'm not using really any of the old parts, and we're just going to be going off of pretty much factory specs on this for, well, maybe a little bit tighter than factory specs, just because it's going to be under a little bit more abuse, and that's just kind of, I'll leave that up to your own decision making on that. So yeah, let's get this thing torn apart. So first, we need to get these bolts out, and they are basically reverse Torx bits. They call them they're like an E14 is what these guys are. So we'll get these guys removed. Oh, I was caught there. Okay, now we're going to put these bolts to the side, take out the longer two bolts that are there, and then basically the next thing we're going to do is give this housing a little bit of a tap, because all there is on this outer portion is basically a rubber O-ring that keeps this stuff together. Oh, on this one it looks like it has the ADD actuator. Oh, this is the vacuum operated one. So we're just going to keep that joint there together. This one right here is going to stay together because we don't have to take that one apart. It's not really necessary to open up the ADD actuator. I was going to do it just to show you, but there's really no point in me pulling off the ADD actuator while I'm doing this, because that system will all be just fine as is. So we're just going to throw in these screws back into here and just take off the lower portion of it. So basically we're just going to take off this guy right down here, come up just like so. So that bolts out. And then we'll take this one right over here. We'll tap so we're fully seated. Perfect. Okay. Now that those guys are mobile, what we can do is just tap the whole housing out. So we're just trying to get the fippage to break. There we go. Got that piece off. So there's fippage sealant that was right inside there. This is the AD actuator that goes inside the ADD housing, which that part right there just kind of holds everything together. We don't really need to take that part off because there's actually a little bit of a adjustment nut that prevents that from removing it, and you'd unbolt your AD actuator right here. So we're just gonna take this and put this off to the side. We're gonna cover it later so we don't get any dirt or anything in it. And then right here, we have our stub shaft. So basically, this is the passenger side stub shaft. This little shaft right here is only about 3 or 4 inches long, and it goes directly into the diff. So on the opposite side, on the driver's side, this side over here is where the driver's side CV axle goes into and goes into the needle bearing. This side over here, it's the same thing. It's shaped just like the inner shaft on the CV axle, but instead of connecting part of the CV axle, it connects to the extension housing. So this thing is just kind of held in there just like a clip, just like a normal CV axle. So what I like to use is a slide hammer, and we're gonna pull that out. So let me grab some slide hammer attachments and we'll pull that guy out of there. Okay, so here's some tools. Get you guys out of the way. Make sure I didn't do this upside down, which I think it is. Nope, that one's upside down. This side's right side up. Okay, there we go. All right, so we just want it to go down beneath this arm right here. And I have shaved mine down just to get a little bit of clearance on these guys. So basically what I'm going to do is give this guy a little bit of a tap. If he wants to cooperate. Come on, buddy. There it is. Perfect. Okay, so now this guy's in there. Normally you'd want to put on 2 of these guys, but my attachment can't hold the 2 teeth in that manner. So I found it's been pretty easy just to remove it as is. So what we're gonna do is just do the 1 tooth and spin on this guy. Get that attached. Check 1 more of these guys. So we're going to put that through here. And we're going to want to go like this on this side. Okay, next up. There we go. That's up now. And then we can just use basically a small pry bar and just give it a little wiggle. Just like that. And there is our stub shaft. So this thing is kind of small inside here compared to other differentials, but that's basically the same size as the shaft that goes into on the CV axle, the inner joint of the CV axle, but this is the stub shaft for the extension housing. Put that to the side. I'm going to put my tools away. Perfect. Then over here. Cool. Now, next up, we are going to open up the case and access the ring gear. Basically, the differential carrier is what it's also known as. Not like the carrier bearing on the rear driveline. A differential carrier is basically the component that carries the ring gear and the spider gear assembly and the side gears. That's technically called a carrier. So we're gonna open up the case to access the carrier, and then we'll be able to take out the ring gear and take some, remove the pinion flange and get out the pinion gear as well. So what I like to do is I usually take a block of wood, kind of put it underneath there, give it a little bit of stability. Take that guy, get a 14mm socket, safety glasses. Oh, these ones are cleaner. Do the clean ones. All right, earplugs. Get the gun. Okay. All right, all those bolts are out of there. So the case is now still stuck to the housing. So it hasn't budged at all. It's pretty much in the same location. So we're gonna take a hammer, and I like to use a brass hammer on this one, just because I don't want to mar up any of the edges where it could be, mating. And if you mar up the edges here, the case is actually what applies the preload to the carrier assembly. So we want to make sure we don't affect the preload at all, because we want to try to make sure there's a little bit of tension still on inside the differential carrier on the inside. So give this guy a little tap, and there's little nubs all the way around the diff, these little tabs, and they are perfect for opening up this case. Instead of trying to, use a chisel or a flathead screwdriver, which I don't really like to do. All right, the seal is breaking. Now we just got to overcome the dowels, the alignment pins that are in it. They get a little rusty. Which can make it a little difficult to remove. Usually I'll take out the alignment pins or the dowels during the entire process until I'm ready for my final assembly, because those guys are just a kind of a pain to work with until you're ready for your final assembly. She's coming. There it is. Okay, there is the clamshell housing. This is how it kind of gets its name for clamshell, because it's basically like a shell. And so this side is actually where we're going to be installing the air fitting for the ARB locker. There's basically going to be an O-ring thing here and a sleeve system that kind of seals it up so we can get the air supply going to it. This is the part that we're going to have to modify. And then we have the ring gear assembly. Oh, one thing too is you notice that this differential is a little dirty at the moment, which normally, if you're reusing all these parts, cleanliness is a huge factor when you're working on differentials. Cleanliness is a big deal. Inside these bearings and everything, there's very high tolerances, and a little speck, a grain of sand, even if you're using the wrong towels, these things, they leave a lot of fibers. And when you try to clean up a bearing on the fibers, you can get inaccurate readings and kind of clog up the bearing with fibers. So I use a lot of microfiber or lint-free cloths when I'm doing my final assembly. But since I'm literally not using anything out of this diff except for this pinion flange, everything else on the internals, the differential carrier, the bearings, the ring gear, the pinion bearings, all of it is gonna be pretty much tossed away. The only thing we need is this pinion flange, this flange right here where the driveline goes on. The rest of the case, it's all dirty and everything. We're gonna be putting this through a parts washer, getting it all cleaned up. So I'm gonna wait for that. I mean, it's a messy job, and I don't wanna get water in here. That's why I would have pressure washed this beforehand, but we don't want to get all that stuff inside the bearings. So we have a ring gear right here. So you turn the drive line, turns the ring gear, now it's face down so you can't actually see the gears. So what I like to do is I'll take this little aluminum spacer here. Easiest way to grab these things is just kind of grab the bearing right here and just pull straight up and out. Pull that guy out, and there's your clamshell case. It's a big kind of depression inside there. You can see that's where the ring gear goes and the carrier assembly. And then there's your pinion gear right there. So we're gonna be getting a new pinion gear, and this whole assembly is gonna be replaced. So we don't really need to keep any of that stuff. The stuff that we need to keep though are the shims. There's shims inside here behind the bearing races. You can kind of see it. But basically, this is what they look like brand new. I have my measurement on there because I measure all these with micrometers, and I keep a whole stack of them just so I can keep reference and the sizes of everything. But basically, each of these shims are a specific size. There's a shim there, and there's a shim there beneath the bearing race. And the bearing race basically looks like this. It's what houses the bearing to kind of sit inside there. It goes over, well, this one doesn't fit this bearing, but it's what sits over that. Now that shim sits behind here, and that pushes up against the bearing, giving you your preload. The preload, and you can also adjust your backlash through here, and technically your pinion depth if you want to get technical. But this is what applies the pressure on the bearings. If you don't get your measurements right for these guys, the shims, you can end up with a bad diff. Now, the trick here is that we want to reuse these shims and put them back in when we put in the Arabie locker and the new 488s, but then we have to take our measurements. And then once we take our measurements of our preload, our backlash, and all that stuff, we kind of got to find out where everything's at, and then we check our gear contact pattern, and if everything checks out, we keep it. But usually, in a perfect world, that sounds great and all, but every gear assembly, every ring and pinion, every bearing, every tooth, every race, everything, all has a little bit of variances. I mean, if we're talking down to the 10,000ths of a millimeter or an inch, 10,000ths of an inch. And you get a bunch of those combinations and you start to stack it up. Well, next thing you know, your backlash is way out, your preload's way too high, or just the assembly is just moving way too much in there. So you gotta do adjustments, and that's how you fine tune a differential assembly. Okay, so next up is we want to mount. I basically want to get this guy mounted onto here. Well, actually, I probably don't need to mount that yet. I'm probably going to use this in the press to get this guy out of here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to take off this pinion flange. Pinion flange has basically a nut on it, lock nut, that you have a little tab on it that you got to open it up. So I have a little chisel that I like to use. Should have found that before I started the video, because there's like 40 different places I can have it. Oh, I got too many toolboxes.